So Ganesh is an engineer from IIT Delhi. He has had an interest in space science ever since he was in school. After completing his MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, he spent most of his professional life in a multinational organization in the field of technology. And about 8 years ago, Ganesh developed an interest in the Puranas. He was fascinated by the insights the ancient text offered, particularly the parallels to space science, and he has researched most of the Mahapuranas besides other texts in preparation for writing a book. The title of his book is From the Beginning of Time. That reminds me of Stephen Hawking's famous title of The Brief History of Time. But and Ganesh currently lives in Singapore. So welcome, Ganesh. Please begin.
Thanks very much, Mohan. Thanks for the introduction. And hello, everybody. The segment that follows is probably going to be very different than what you've been hearing. It talks about Puranas as a source of science. Actually, what we'll be doing is talking about it in the context of the life cycle of the sun. Anyway, so while they are making the switch, so the word Purana in Sanskrit actually means ancient. So it is surprising that one would try and conflate something that is ancient, a text that describes itself as ancient, with the science of the life cycle of the sun, which is something that we've essentially understood in the last few decades. So anyway, so my suggestion is that you wait till the end of this discussion and then make up your mind on what you think before you come to any decision. So am I sharing my screen now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of introductory remarks. First thing is the presentation cites verses from the Brahmanda Purana. The book cites verses from a dozen different Puranas, and all the verses are in English. So, I mean, there's nothing at this stage in Sanskrit or any other language. The English translations that I used are by a board of scholars that were sponsored by the government of India in the 1950s, and no alterations have been made to the translations. And both the science and the Puranas are quoted, and each segment begins with the science. So they provide a context for us to understand the verse better, right? So let's begin with the science of the sun. Very briefly, the sun is one of the billions of low mass stars in the universe. It is the host star for our solar system, which means that all the solar system is bound by the gravitational force of the sun. It is the source of all our energy in the solar system. So it's the one element that produces energy in the solar system. And we can look at the sun as being composed of two parts. There's a core which produces the energy and where the fusion occurs. This is a region of very high temperature and pressure. And then there's a shell where this energy is transferred outwards through convection and radiation. And as for modern science, the life cycle of the sun is composed of 5 stages. There is a stage of birth. There is a stage of a young star. Hard as it may be to believe, even stars have a juvenile state where they are extremely active. There is a current mature stage, which is about 4.5 billion years old already, and is expected to continue for another 3 to 5 billion years, after which the sun transitions into a red giant. And then it gets to the white dwarf stage, which is essentially spells the death of the star. And for this discussion, we'll go through the red giant and the white dwarf stages of the star. So in about 3 to 5 billion years from now, the hydrogen in the core gets exhausted. Essentially, it all gets converted to helium. And once that happens, the sun can produce energy in 2 ways. So the helium in the core can fuse to form carbon, which is the next higher atom in the chain. And then the hydrogen in the shell can start to fuse to form helium. And what this does is that it releases an enormous amount of energy, and the sun grows hugely in size. It just becomes huge in size and becomes what is known as a red giant. And interestingly, what happens is that the sun grows so big that the planets of Mercury and Venus get absorbed into the orb of the sun. And you can see a schematic here where you have the disk of the sun, and then you don't see Mercury or Venus, and then you see Earth right next to it. There's been a lot of computer modeling around this in the community, in the scientific community. And as per the current models, the surface of the red giant sun comes up very close to the Earth, and the sun is burnt, and the Earth is burnt by the sun's heat and all the flares that come up from the sun's surface. And there is a lava and hot rock on the Earth, and the Earth's crust cracks, and the hot mantle that is below the Earth's crust breaks through to the surface. And you can see the artist's impression here on the right, that the Earth literally glows from the heat of the sun. It's a very frightening picture, but that's where the current scientific thinking resides. Let's see what the Puranas say about it. The Purana, just like modern science, is a specific term for the sun as a red giant sun. The Puranas call the sun in this stage is the Samvartaka Aditya. Samvartaka means destruction, Aditya means the sun. And so the Purana says, when the end of the Kalpa arrives, the sun of 7 rays assumes the form of Samvartaka Aditya, the sun of final annihilation, and burns down the 3 worlds. And so it's from the Brahmanda Purana, it's from the book 2, section 3 and chapter 3. So all the citations have the Purana, the book, so that, and the verse number, so that anybody interested in doing more research can go back and reference it. This is not a stray verse in the Puranas. So I just want to add, there is a passage of almost 25 such verses, and in the Brahmanda Purana, and to go through it will take an enormous amount of time. So I'll just give you a sampler of verses to give you a sense of the detail in the Puranas, right? So it starts with a drought on the planet, and this is when the sun is still growing in size. It's not yet the full red giant that we saw in the earlier artist illustration, but as it grows bigger, it heats up the earth, which leads to a drought. And the Purana says, then a continued drought lasting for 100 years takes place. Living beings deficient in strength become dissolved and get mingled with the dust. So essentially what it says is that if a plant or an animal is reliant on water, then it dies, and its body and its bones get converted to ash and dust, essentially. And then it says that the rivers and the oceans are turned into vapor. The Purana says, the 7 rays of the sun that blazes in the sky, sucking up water, drink up water from the great ocean. And then it goes on to talk about the soil and the rocks, saying, being burned by their brilliant flames, the earth, including mountains, rivers, and oceans, becomes bereft of moisture and vicinity. And finally, the verse describes the earth as literally glowing from the sun's heat. It says, getting the fiery splendor transmitted to it, the entire universe slowly assumes the form of a huge block of iron and shines thus. And this is just what we saw in the artist illustration a short while back. And this is just as suggested by modern science. So an amazing correlation. So let's go on to the next stage, which is the white dwarf stage. And the core, in this stage, the core continues to undergo fusion. And so we saw that the helium fuses to form carbon, and over time, the carbon fuses to form oxygen, which is the next larger atom. And this process carries on till the atoms become so large they can no longer fuse. And when they can no longer fuse, they can no longer release energy. And what happens is that it's important to understand that in the sun that we see today, there is a core that produces an enormous amount of energy and heat, and which creates an outward pressure. And this pressure is dynamically in balance with the gravitational force of the huge ball of gas that the sun is. And so the sun is this perfectly spherical object that's glowing up in the sky. But once the core stops producing energy, then the core just collapses very quickly, and it forms a white dwarf. And the white dwarf is the size of the Earth, so it's very small and extremely dense. And what happens as a result is that the planet starts to cool rapidly. And so we need to look at it in the form of the red giant sun, which was very large and its surface was very close to the Earth, and it was heating up the planet. And now the surface of this white dwarf sun is millions of miles away from the Earth, and it's not producing any heat. So effectively, it starts to cool the planet very rapidly. And what happens is that the water vapor in the atmosphere condenses to form giant clouds. And I have underlined the word giant here because this is far removed from anything of our everyday experience. So we need to imagine that during the red giant phase, the entire amount of water in the oceans, in the lakes, in the ponds, in the rivers has evaporated and gone into the atmosphere. And this includes the water in the polar ice sheets, in the glaciers, in the tops of mountains, in the bodies of plants and animals and insects that have water. Everything has now gone into the atmosphere. And this entire mass of superheated vapor is now condensing to form clouds. And let's see what the Puranas say about it. So the Puranas talk about this as the Samvartaka clouds, the clouds of dissolution. And it says, some of the clouds are the size of an excellent city. Some can be compared to herds of elephants. And some clouds shine like huge mountains. And then it says that the clouds shower torrential rain. The clouds shower rains in huge torrents. They destroy the whole of the extremely terrific and inauspicious fire. The earth gets flooded, and it is the pralaya at the end of the kalpa. So it says, when the water so profusely showered, the universe gets filled up with it. So in summary, if you look at it, we saw the 5 stages of the life cycle of the sun: the birth, the young, and the mature, and the red giant. And we saw in the previous few minutes, we saw the sun described as the Samvartakaditya, describing the red giant phase. We saw the Samvartaka clouds describing the white dwarf stage of the sun. And obviously, for want of time, I did not talk about the birth. There is a story called The Birth of Martanda, which describes this birth of Martanda as an inert star. Martanda, the etymology of Martanda is the word mrita, which is dead, and anda, which is fear. And so every star is born as an inert ball of gas that emits neither heat nor light. Then there's the story of the marriage of Samjana and Vivaswan, which is the young star, and Vivaswan is the young, active sun. Vivaswan is another name of the sun, and Vivaswan gets married to Samjana, and after marriage, he becomes mature. He becomes the mature star that we see in the skies today, and that's a beautiful story. So both the story of Martanda and Samjana describe these 2 stages in allegory. We saw, and there is a description of the water cycle in the Puranas. The water cycle was first understood in Western science in the 16th century by a French engineer. And so that's very well described. So you have an amazing amount of detail that's in the Puranas that in relation to the sun. And then it's not just the sun, it talks about the space and the geosciences as well. There is the science of the earth. It talks about the geography, the events in the past of the earth, such as the descent of Ganga. It talks about the Brahmanda, which is the Bhumandala, or the planetary disk, the disk of the planets which surrounds the sun, and the Loka, which is the Padala Loka, the regions of space above and below this planetary disk, the Devaloka and the Padala Loka. And probably the most complex of them all, it talks about the origin, disappearance, and the reappearance of the moon during the churning of the Kshirodasagara. And the origin of the moon is an area of current research now. It's not settled science. There's a lot that we still need to learn. There are some very compelling hypotheses, but it's not settled science. So some of these, all of these have been discussed in this book that I recently published. But the Puranas are a veritable encyclopedia of knowledge, and cosmology is a small portion of it, but there's a lot just in cosmology that we can learn from the Puranas. So I want to talk about Puranas in the nature of scientific inquiry, and there is this beautiful verse that I found also in the Brahmanda Purana, which says, The learned man should comprehend and retain in belief by means of scripture, inference, perception, and reasoning after testing intelligently and carefully. So, the first thing that is fascinating about this is it talks about scriptures as one of the four sources of knowledge. Inference, perception, and reasoning are the other three. So while scripture is primary, it's not the only source of knowledge. The second thing, and this is amazing, is that it talks about it being tested before acceptance. So most ancient texts rely on faith for acceptance, unquestioning acceptance. And here is a text that actually asks you to question and test intelligently and carefully. And this is a text that's considered canon and asks you to test all statements intelligently and carefully, including its own statements. So I thought this was a very, very telling statement in the Puranas. And finally, what I thought was interesting, it parallels the scientific method. So the scientific method is the steps of hypothesize, make a prediction, test for the prediction, and then once the test is accepted and peer reviewed, then you adopt it. All of these steps have been described, the testing and the subsequent adoption have been described elegantly in a single verse. And so in closing, I'd like to say a couple of things. So as far as education is concerned, aspects of the Puranas that are completely aligned with science, such as the life cycle of the sun, should be treated as a part of the history of science. I think they call out the fact that this knowledge was available to mankind way before. It's just that as we did not, the people reading the Puranas did not have an understanding of the life cycle of the sun, and so could not make the transition from what the written word was to what actually happened. There are other parts which are similar to science, but not identical. And again, I think science is primary in education. And one of the examples is the origin of the moon, as I just said. It's an area of current investigation. And we can use these as hypotheses that need to be tested. And if these stand up to scientific scrutiny, then I think there is a reason that they can be a part of the history of science or of knowledge. And finally, Indian texts are known for ritual and devotion, and and primarily for their exposition of the parts of karma and bhakti. May I also suggest that they be known for knowledge and the path of jnana, and more specifically for the area of vijnana. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the event. Thank you, Mohan.
Thank you, Ganesh.